Greetings, my fellow freedom sovereign thinkers. LL3's newest podcast. My name is Craig, transmitting from the beautiful swampy mangoes of South Florida. And today's date is Wednesday, January 9th, 2019. Let's begin. Ooh, sorry about that. A bit of a late delay there for the signal, but hopefully everyone had a great holiday. I know it took some time off, filled some personal achievements, which I'm very proud of. And I know 2019 is going to be another political cloak and dagger year, right? New House, new Senate, clowns from both left and right, even on the state level too. And I haven't really paid too much attention to State Union address and inaugural speech from Governor DeSantis. There was a claim he used quotes from Hamilton and Lincoln. Like, oh my goodness. Good grief. I just never believed the hype, my friend. So this should be the year of vigilance and endurance. Added to it for the 21st century, to be exact. Too many folks out there still want to look for the Lord and Savior. It was fun because even you got a couple folks out there now want to run for president, like Elizabeth Warren, who hates our Bill of Rights culture. And I found out even dumbed down Nancy Pelosi doing the same thing. Come on. You think you're trying to con us all? It's going to blow back in your faces. Do yourself a favor. Recant it. Because it's contaminating space. Yes. Indeed. Every state in the union, the people in every state in this country need to start exercising vigilance, nullification, put their servants' feet to the fire. And ask them why you're being funded by men like George Soros and Sheldon Adelson, etc. Those are the things you got to think about, my friends. Who cares what the garbage media has to say? Doesn't matter what paradigm. They're all a joke. People still watch it? I'm trying to figure that one out. Well, I'm just like I said, I'm just excited to be here and took some time. So I know I'm digressing. But you know what? That's how life is. So whatever you do, govern yourselves instead of some slugs that have a law degree tell you any different. Because the fact is this, my friends. Without us, they are nothing. Not vice versa. So don't live in fear. Remain vigilant. That's just the beginning. So, I'll be talking a couple of articles here and some quotes from the Bob Livingston's news site. Good stuff. And I'll start off here from the verdict. It says, why Facebook's hate speech policy makes so little sense. This came out today by Michael C. Dorf. D-O-R-F. Posted under Speech and Religion. As it reads here, a recent New York Times article disclosed details of Facebook's global effort to block hate speech and other ostensibly offensive content. It will make us feel safe. As the article explains, Facebook has a good reason to worry that some people use this platform not just to offend, but to undermine democracies and even incite deadly violence. Yet Facebook's response seems curious, even perverse. Presumably well-being, young engineers and lawyers gather every other week to update thousands of PowerPoint presentations, rules, and guidelines for its roughly 15,000 relatively low-skilled moderators to apply formulaic, excuse me, hopefully I pronounced that word right, to sort permissible from verboten posts, sometimes using Google Translate for material in languages they do not know. It is easy to condemn Facebook's approach to hate speech as ham-fisted. It is considerably harder to fashion a perfect alternative. Below I consider the causes and effects of Facebook's policy. As I shall explain the issues, it raises implicate tough questions regarding free speech more broadly, both in the U.S. and elsewhere. Private versus public censorship. Most countries, including most constitutional democracies, forbid hate speech. The U.S. does not. As construed by the Supreme Court in case like RAV versus St. Paul and Virginia versus Black, the First Amendment protects very offensive speech against censorship, unless the speech in question constitutes incitement, strictly defined in the leading case of Brandenburg versus Ohio, to cover only those words and symbols that are intended and likely to inspire imminent lawless action. The Constitution even protects hate speech that has an historical association with violence. The defendants in each of the cases just sided with charges were cross-burning, and yet they all won. Accordingly, the U.S. government may neither directly censor hate speech nor require private companies like Facebook to do so. However, the Constitution does not apply to private actors, and Facebook has adopted its policy voluntarily. Thus, the policy does not raise a constitutional question here. Yet, given Facebook's reach, one might worry that it exercises the kind of power that governments typically do, and thus should be subject to the same sorts of restrictions that apply to governments, including constitutional limits. In the early 20th century, some progressive thinkers, including Louis Brandeis, who would go on becoming the leading free speech champion of the Supreme Court, made just that sort of argument. Highly concentrated private power, these progressives said, can pose at least as a great threat to liberty as government power does. If Facebook is effectively the only game in town, then it does not much matter from the user's perspective whether Facebook censors in response to a government mandate or its own violation. Interesting there, right? Moreover, it's not fully accurate to say that Facebook censors speech voluntarily. Fewer than 50% of Facebook users live in the U.S. Hundreds of millions live in countries that forbid hate speech. As a recent European Union report underscores, much of the world understands human rights treaties not only to prevent censorship of hate speech, but to affirmatively require it. It does seem likely that Facebook censors hate speech globally in response to a legal obligation to do so in many other countries in which it operates. Americans who prefer the no-holds-bar approach of our constitutional case law may worry that Europeans and others who take a more restrictive view are effectively imposing their hate speech regime on us. Remember, I recommend this: influence by foreign nations is very dangerous. George Washington stated this on his farewell address, and John Jay wrote Fellows Papers 2 through 5. I will continue on here. Whether we should prefer the no-holds-barred approach is a highly contested question. In this brief comment, I can hardly do it justice, so I shall merely refer interested readers to a couple of excellent books arguing opposing sides of the question. Professor Jeremy Waldron of Oxford and NYU Law School defends the European approach in the harm and hate speech. New York Law School professor and former ACLU president Nadine Strazen defends the U.S. approach in hate. Why we should resist it with the speech, with free speech, not censorship. And you can probably get these books online, so check it out. If you find Strazen persuasive, then you may well regard the export of European-style hate speech censorship to the U.S. an unfortunate consequence of the fact that the U.S. Constitution does not apply to private actors like Facebook. The taking advantage of a kind of loophole, if you find Waldron persuasive, you might be grateful for that loophole. But you also might be concerned about the fact that the people are doing the censoring are ultimately accountable only to Facebook's shareholders rather than to the American people via democratic process. It's interesting because there's a lot of claims that they're getting money from public sectors through NATO and Atlantic Council, and it's still a private entity. So that's why it's always a touchy thing. But we'll just continue on here. Rules versus standards. In addition to questioning the fact that Facebook censors hate speech, one might worry about the way it does so. Whether any particular Facebook post poses a genuine danger would typically require a context-sensitive judgment by a person familiar with the language, culture, and locale in question. The rigid application of Facebook's rules, by contrast, inevitably results in a pattern of grossly under and over inclusive censorship. ensnaring innocent speech while dangerous material slips the net. So why does Facebook do it this way? The short answer is that the alternative to rigid rules, a flexible standard, has its own mirroring vice. Flexible standards vest discretion in whoever makes a decision in each case. Such discretion will be exercised inconsistently from decision maker to decision maker, while also being subject to abuse. The sort of person most likely to understand the contextual meaning of a Facebook post will also typically have a political perspective or other bias that can affect the decision rather to censor it. In regulating speech via rigid rules rather than flexible standards, Facebook follows roughly in the path of the Supreme Court case construing the First Amendment. Even when the government may limit speech, as in licensing public property for expressive activities such as marches and rallies, it may also do so pursuant to rules sufficiently determined to avoid granting the licensor unbridled discretion, a la FCC, right? To be sure, there is an important additional limit in the First Amendment context. Licensors must use relatively determinate rules that aim only at the time, place, or matter of speech, but not at its content. By contrast, the Facebook censors take aim at content. But even the First Amendment law occasionally allows restricting speech based on content, especially where the speech falls into one of the small number of what the court has identified as categories of unprotected speech. How does the court draw the boundaries? In near unanimous 2010 case, Chief Justice Roberts asserted that unprotected categories were historically outside the freedom of speech to which the First Amendment refers, but with due respect, that is at best law office history. The court has made no serious effort to check what my colleague, Professor Stephen Schriffen, aptly calls its frozen categories against the understanding of the people in 1781 when the states ratified the First Amendment, or in 1868 when they ratified the 14th Amendment, which makes the First Amendment enforceable against the states. Centralization. And I did a show about the 14th Amendment is unconstitutional. So look it up. Look at my archives. Supreme Court categories of unprotected speech, in fact, arose based on what First Amendment scholar Mevelli Nimmer described in an extremely important 1968 article in the California Law Review as a process of definitional balancing, in which the court weighed the value of categories of speech against the harm they cause for purposes of deciding whether to count a category as protected at law by focusing on the categorical level. Nimmer argues courts should eschew the problematic exercise of discretion inherited in an ad hoc balancing that is balancing the cost of benefits of speech in particular cases. As Nimmer himself explained, the categorical approach is hardly perfect, but the vices it has are the vices of typical rules under and over inconclusiveness as applied to unanticipated or unusual cases. And it is that very same judgment, a greater willingness to tolerate the vices of rules and to tolerate the vices of standards where speech is concerned, that underlies Facebook's efforts to drastically curtail discretion it gives its moderators. So yes, Facebook's rules are ridiculous, but given the legal imperative to censor hate speech in many of the countries in which it operates, Facebook may not have any especially good alternatives. Interesting there. So that's a good content. It does is relevant when you look at it. And the whole thing is this, folks, about Facebook and the corporation and all that. The whole thing about social media in general is, everyone has their different platform. What I do like to utilize these networks, and these groups. I don't have to put my personal life on there, who I'm seeing, who I'm laying, and all that good stuff. But if I'm critical and they call it hate speech, you know what? Like what they did to Alex Jones, for an example. Like him or not, it was wrong. It becomes a domino effect. Now you have other social media sites that are coming out of the woodworks that are more pro-free speech. So when I have individuals out there saying they need their Facebook page, I'm like, what are you doing? Because when you look at it, my friends, they need us more than we need them. That's the bottom line. And it's very disappointing when I have folks out there using like it's some holy grail. And you got some ridiculous people out there who want to talk smack all they want. You got your trolls, and you got know-it-alls. Is it new? And to me, hate speech is free speech, whether you agree with it or not. Everyone made a big stink about the BDS movement, right? They call it anti-Semitic, which is nothing more than a monumental lie. They had a right to free speech too, right? And even on the state level, most 26 states have these BDS laws. So the whole thing is this, my friends. Without us, Facebook is nothing. And I'll be repeating myself. But you got to always look at it that way. There's other alternatives out there. And I post a good amount of them on my page. On my Spreaker page. And I've been censored. Yours.org censored my content. And I never got a response from them. But you know what? Thank you. You inspire me not to be like you guys. I didn't do anything obscene, anything threatened. I want to know what the merits are. And they couldn't give me an answer. 3 months. 2-3 months. You know what? To me, that's being flamboyant. So, my recommendation, don't use it. Because you don't need them. Period. Alright, this one here came from Brandon Smith. Bob Livingston's alerts. As it reads here, Globalist Information Spotlight on Mohamed El-Erian. In this new series of Spotlight articles, I will be publishing intermittently. I plan to highlight specific individuals who work with globalist institutions or who often express pro-globalist sentiments. More to the point, I will be dismantling propaganda coming directly from the mouths of the globalists. I often hear people make argument that alternative analysts should be naming the enemy more often in our work. Of course, if we chase the goal every time, each article would be longer than a book. He's right. I often suggest to those wanting to know who the globalists are, as they simply identify people who explicitly promote globalism. It is not as if the elitists are invisible. They are generally narcissists, and narcissists have big mouths. They are always looking for attention. It's one of the greatest weaknesses because it makes them easy identifiable. But what is globalism? Well, it's a combination of ideological elements. First and foremost, they believe in total centralization of power. This means the eventual erasure of all national borders, all economic divisions, all cultural distinctions. They want a one-world system with a single economic authority, single currency, and a single global government. I'll carry on. This system is sometimes presented as a kind of utopia in which war would be a thing of the past and poverty would be eradicated. The cost of such trade is never mentioned, though. The complete extermination of individuality, personal choice, free thought, and self-sufficiency is the price of the globalist contract with the devil. Globalists also tend to support programs which openly or indirectly favor population control. This includes programs posing as environmentally conscious. The climate change and carbon taxation schemes in particular are designed to reduce access to energy, making production expansion impossible, thereby shrinking the means to support the current or larger population. Political puppets of the globalist agenda are not always obviously outright. They may at times even attack globalism and pretend to fight for nationalism or against climate change. We call these politicians controlled opposition. The easiest way to determine if a politician's control is to identify the people they surround themselves with. Who do they associate with? Who is advising them? if they are surrounded by known globalists and banking elites on a regular basis, then they are a puppet, either knowingly or unknowingly, or we call them the PR man, PR person, public relations. Their actions will only ever serve globalist interests, and when their careers are over, it will be clear that their pro-sovereignty rhetoric sounded good while they were in office, but every policy they asserted pushed globalism forward or made it anti-globalist absurd and dangerous. There are also many who argue in favor of globalism without really knowing the evil that it entails. We call these people useful idiots. These rubes are usually suckered into the fold by particular brands of propaganda. Some propaganda appeals to people's sense of superiority or vanity, suggesting that they are far more brilliant than the majority and thus more valuable to society. Other propaganda plays on people's fear of standing outside the mainstream. It seeks to create the illusion of consensus. Global warming propaganda does this often, in which people are convinced that everyone knows that a particular lie is actually a universal truth. The facts might suggest otherwise, but false consensus is designed to make people feel afraid to express their doubts about mainstream viewpoints. They are afraid to be chastised by friends, family, or the public at large, and so they keep their mouths shut. Never realize that many millions of other people might share their doubts, and they are not an isolated minority. Propaganda relies on calculated disinformation. Usually globalists use other people for this task. They exploit the controlled media, or they can exploit controlled opposition, or they use anonymous disinformation agents to attack anyone that has the courage to present the truth publicly. But as stated earlier, most of them are narcissistic and cannot keep themselves away from the spotlight. In this week's article, I will be focused on Mohamed El-Erian, who has been very active in media in the past month. Some of my reader may recognize the name. El-Erian has been an active promoter of a global currency system based on the IMF's SDR basket system. He suggests that a global currency might be an effective way to combat the dangers of populist nationalism. El-Erian is an Egyptian-born economic advisor to El-Erian, the parent company of PIMCO, one of the largest investment firms in the world. Many Federal Reserve officials work within PIMCO before or after their time at the central bank, including former Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan. El-Erian served as the chair on Barack Obama's Global Development Council, as worked as deputy director of the IMF in the 1980s. Ain't that nice? Yes, we can. Yes, we can. We'll bow down to a puppet messiah. With this kind of background, it should come as no surprise that El-Erian spreads disinformation in favor of the globalist agenda. Recently, El-Erian penned an op-ed for Bloomberg News in which he presented a number of fallacies on the state of the economy. Let's look at some of the most important pieces of disinformation. El-Erian argues that there will be no recession. Let's be clear. The U.S. and most of the world has been in a state of recession and depression ever since the crash of 2008. If you're economically must be artificially supported by central bank fiat printing for 10 years, just keep the system from plunging into chaos, then your economy is in a steep and permanent decline. Hiding it with central bank stimulus measures might hide a recession status in a technical way, but fundamentally negative growth is always threat if the life support plug is pulled. It is exactly what is happening today as the Fed tightens policy and removes the liquidity from the economy. Currently, we are seeing a steep drop in housing markets. Auto markets, credit markets, and stock markets are on the verge of entering bear market territory. All this began after the Fed started raising interest rates and cutting its balance sheet. It should be obvious to anyone with that sense that the economy is crashing, and it is crashing because of the Fed. You don't have to be a Trump lover on this, okay? Just don't scapegoat him. El-Erian knows he's telling a lie, which is why he covers himself by noting that though we will not suffer recession, we will see a slowdown unless we build pro-growth policies. Why would globalists like El-Erian lie about the real threat to our economic system? For one, there are culprits behind the crash in 2008. They create the subsequent everything bubble, and now they are deliberately popping that bubble to cause another crisis. It behooves them to hide instability until they are ready to blame it on a predetermined scapegoat. I also found in my studies that it is very common for a globalist and their media partners to attempt to keep the public as obvious as possible before every crash. I suspect this accomplished two things. One, it means that the public will be caught completely off guard and unprepared for the crisis. Two, it fools the investment community into keeping their capital within the system when they should be liquidating their holdings and running for the hills. For every market crash, including the Great Depression, there was a chorus of elites and media puppets telling people they would be fools if they pulled out their money. As the bank cabal and the globalists sell their holdings and position for the crash, they need greater fools to buy. Retail investors and day traders usually end up being the greater fools. Absolutely. Continue on here. El-Erian defends central banks. The former IMF official laments the idea that central banks might suffer more criticism over policy tightening and the consequences it might produce. El-Erian instead blames turmoil in Washington, including the government shutdown. I've been warning for, quote, some time that Donald Trump has been providing the perfect distraction for the central banks as they remove stimulus support from the economy and deliberately initiate a controlled demolition from the financial bubble they created after 2008. I outlined Trump's status as controlled opposition in my recent article, Trump is a Pied Piper for the New World Order Agenda. El-Erian's rhetoric added to Trump's consistent habit of taking credit for the stock market bubble supports my position. While Trump has criticized the Fed for raising interest rates and threatening the bull market in stocks, this comes off as a ranting of a man-child when Trump also claims he's the reason for the stock rally for the past 2 years and that his own trade war triggered the glitch which has brought equities down the past month. Ultimately, Trump's trade war and the government shutdown are already being used by globalists as a cover for their activities. El-Erian is just one of many elitists spreading the lie that Trump is causing the crash, rather than central banks. Meantime, El-Erian warns that 1,000-point swings in the Dow will become commonplace, which is the only truthful comment in his op-ed. However, he acts as though this should not be a concern, as if such volatility is normal. El-Erian says the economy will remain strong. Globalists often use faulty statistics as a means to misrepresent the true health of the economy. Unemployment numbers are a favorite tool, though the official stats show unemployment percentages at an all-time low. The Bureau of Labor Statistics chooses to leave out certain important details, such as the fact that around 96 million people are not counted as unemployed because they have been jobless for so long they aren't on the rolls anymore. The BLS also counts underemployed people with minimum hours as if they are fully employed workers. Sure, the unemployment rate continues to go down because more and more people are being removed from the rolls and more people are settling for low-wage part-time service jobs because they are the only jobs available. Another stat globalists use is GDP. The official GDP number is a farce built on numerous fallacies. The most prominent tactic for juicing GDP is calculated in government expenditures as if they are production, meaning the government steals your money through taxation, preventing you from using it to produce and then uses on it on wasteful government programs, which are then counted as part of GDP. This even includes such programs as Obamacare. GDP also does not consider true inflation. Yes, American consumers spend an increased amount of their income each year, but this is not because they are more affluent than the year before. It is because most goods and services cost more due to inflation. GDP does not represent legitimate production or the health of the economy, and neither do labor statistics. El-Erian is doing what all globalists do too, which is misinform the public as much as possible up to a crash of a system. The more fear and uncertainty the public feels during the crisis, the more malleable they become, the more power the globalists can take for themselves in the process. As this series continues, you will find that globalists like El-Erian are all pushing a similar narrative in concert with each other, indicating cohesive conspiracy, not random coincidence. That is true. And it's been going on for a very long time. Even the Great Depression in the United States, the Federal Reserve was responsible for that. But they want to blame the open free market or capitalism, which is a complete lie. Study the past, folks. It's today's greatest teacher. Even look what happened in France, Greece, European Union, all those areas. Central banks, private banks, they're devious. They are tyrannical to the core. Look to Mohamed El-Erian. At least I don't have to pull down my pants to get respect. You do. And you're still one contemptuous stooge. Ooh, okay. So I'm just gonna... I'll be back. Stay tuned. Cool. Just had to do a little quick breather. And this one here came out today from bearingarms.com. And it's in reference to Jewish synagogues embracing guns in Pews after Pittsburgh. Came out today as well by Tom Knighton. And as it reads here, the Jewish people have fascinating history of being knocked down and repeatedly getting back up. Their history is filled with enslavement and defeat, a history darker than pretty much any other group in the world. That's before you get to talk about the Holocaust. What happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue, while an awful tragedy, is just a bump in the history of the Jewish people when you step away and take a look and try to look at it dispassionately. But Pittsburgh was recent. Is in our minds right now, and that makes it large and more pronounced than enslavement by the Egyptians, for example. What that in mind, it is any wonder that some Jews are carrying guns to the temple? Is it wonder that the synagogues are getting more and more comfortable with that? On an average Saturday morning at the Orthodox Othel Tafalia Synagogue on Chicago's north side, about 10% of the men carry a handgun. That number may seem high in a liberal city with some of the strictest gun laws in the country, which is unconstitutional under our own state constitution. Illegal. All you gotta do is read the Illinois Constitution. That law is null and void. But in the aftermath of the Pittsburgh Synagogue massacre last year, Rabbi Mosiah Rava accept its will grow. He wouldn't be surprised if soon 10 of the 40 or so men who pray there each week, 25% will be packing heat. Definitely, Pittsburgh sparked the interest. The rabbi said regarding gun ownership, originally it was much more of a taboo topic in the community. Definitely people are much more understanding of the idea. There's more and more problems and things happening. Supporters and opponents of guns in synagogue who spoke to JTA repeated familiar arguments on both sides of the debate. Rabbis who don't want their firearms in their congregation said that more guns could mean more injury or death, inadvertent or not, as well as the growth of what they call an already problematic gun culture. But supporters of armed congregants said that with responsible training, they are necessary defense in an age of frequent mass shootings. Call it a good Jewish guy with a gun. We don't want to look as an easy target, said Rabbi Stewart Ferduro of Shahar HaShalom, a conservative synagogue in Houston that allows a concealed carry of handguns, but not open carry. People understand when seconds count, the police are minutes away. They understand that they have to take personal responsibility for those they love. After Pittsburgh members of my congregation are very alert when someone walks into the building. In Texas, where more than a third of the residents own guns, the fault line isn't between whether to allow or ban guns, but whether to allow open carry as well as concealed guns. Congregation Sharia Israel, a conservative synagogue in Dallas, also bans open carry but not concealed carry. Rabbi Ari Sunshine said that he assumes some congregants bring guns to synagogues and that in the Lone Star State a blanket prohibition on guns will not come up. We're a synagogue. We want to preserve a sacred space. And the idea of having guns in full view, that's not just part of the idea of the sanctity of a sacred space, he said. Not all synagogues are growing more comfortable with guns in the pews. However, truthfully, most synagogues are products of the society that surround them. Synagogues in Texas, for example, are more likely to enhance a pro-gun approach than in New York City. So considering their gun culture as well as recent events, I'm more surprised that I could articulate that any synagogue would outright oppose the right of Jews to keep and bear arms, yet they do. Then again, anti-gunners are anti-gunners. They all come from all religions, even one with the history of being oppressed like Jews for some unimaginable reason. It's interesting about that because I always tell the people out there, read the Torah. It explains natural Jewish law. And I know many of you probably heard my past episode about the Tree of Life, Synagogue Massacre, and natural Jewish law, how Rabbi Meyer contradicted and his congregation as well. So I know I talked about it before, but it's good to know these things. And that's why a person like myself, if someone claims to be Jewish and they support stuff that's tyrannical or corrupt, they're not more than a Jew in name only. Anchoring for that's a gyno. That's worse than using other anti-Semitic slangs, okay, or rhetoric. Because they have obligations as well. We all do. On protecting the innocent when it's necessary. And I know a lot of you heard my shows in the past. Technically the police aren't obligated to protect you as an individual. They just look up state sovereign, engine search, state sovereign immunity and tort liability. There's plenty of information out there, folks. So this is why I do give the thumbs up to those synagogues that are pro-firearms, pro-self-defense. And it makes me feel good because never again. It's got to be consistent. So that's how I got to look at it. All right. Do one more here. And this one came from Bob Livingston. This one's entitled The Christian in the State. As it reads here, what is a Christian's responsibility in relationship to the government? Should a Christian participate in government by voting or holding an elective office? Should he criticize government and government officials, or is that the contrary to God's law? Many Christian men and women are confused about this. I know some Christians who believe they shouldn't participate in government at all, not by questioning its motives, protesting its wrongs, working for it, holding elective office, or even voting. Citing Romans 13, some of our more conservative brethren would tell us that there is little we can or should do or say in response to an abusive government because it is established by God. Beyond praying that our leaders to look God when making laws, that they are not make laws that would hinder our worship. Those Christians hardly discuss politics at all. preferring instead to be content with being in subjection. Interesting there as well, right? To them, questioning the authority and actions of leaders is a tantamount to engage in a spirit of rebellion, not just against government men, but against God. But it is. That's a question. If we write or speak about corrupt government institutions, politicians, or bureaucrats, are we acting contrary to God's word in Romans 13? Clearly, Apostle Paul tells us that we must be in subjection to the governing authorities. The passage reads, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed an ordinance of God. And they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise for the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the ones who practices evil. Therefore it is necessary to be the subjection, not only because of wrath, but is also for conscience' sake. For because of this you also pay taxes for rules of servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them. Tax to whom tax is due. Custom to whom custom. Fear to whom fear. Honor to whom honor. That's Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. Paul understood that government wasn't necessarily good. He had himself participated in persecution of Christians on behalf of Jewish authorities, and with a wink, a nod from Roman government. He lived under the Roman Empire, which persecuted Christians as a matter of course. Doing so, he was also later subjected to the Jewish, Pharisaical, and Sadduceal systems. Bear with me, folks, please. Which again were persecuting Christians, while Roman authorities turned a blind eye. That sought to have him imprisoned and executed. During his life, he was imprisoned, stoned, and beaten, and left for dead for defying government authority. In Acts 22, we read that Paul was seized in Jerusalem because he preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law and this place. And besides, he has even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. That's Acts chapter 21, verse 28. He was taken away by Roman guards at the direction of the Jews and stretched out with thongs so as to be scourged. The text reads, but when they stretched him out with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, it is lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned. When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and told him, saying, what are you about to do? For this man is a Roman. The commander came and said to him, tell me, are you Roman? He said, yes. The commander answered, I require this citizenship with a large sum of money. And Paul said, I was actually born a citizen. Therefore, those who were about to examine him immediately let go of him. And the commander was afraid when he found out that he was a Roman, and because they had put him in chains. That's from Acts chapter 22, verses 25 to 29. What Paul did here was to invoke his rights as a citizen. He did so in Acts 25:11, when he appealed to Caesar over his imprisonment to find the Jewish ruling authorities who he believed he had not wronged. So Paul provides with us a perfect example of how we should model our relationship to government. Clearly, our example in Scripture is we can use the legal rights available to us under the laws. Voila! To be a Christian, we are to be like Christ. In Matthew 23, Christ told his disciples that the scribes and Pharisees had seated themselves in Moses' chair, had taken for themselves Moses' authority, and they, the disciples, were to do what the rulers told them to do, but not to do as the scribes and the Pharisees did, because they were hypocrites. The scribes and the Pharisees claimed to follow the law and held people to the law, but did not follow it themselves. It's like saying, you gotta comply, we don't have to administer. That's called exceptionalism. And I've seen it all the time. That sounds very much like a political class today who are walking the halls of power in the district of criminals and in most state capitals. Jesus called out the scribes and Pharisees as hypocrites in the 8 woes he uttered, as recorded in verses 13 through 29, pointing out their wrongdoing. That's Matthew, to be exact. The First Amendment protects, to some extent, our freedom to engage in speech and to petition the government for redress of grievances. When we put out speech or writing the corrupt nature of politicians and government institutions, and how they have exceeded the authority granted them under the Constitution, we are doing no more than Christ did when he called out the scribes and Pharisees, and no more than Paul did when he invoked his rights as a Roman citizen under Roman law. As Chuck Baldwin explains, America is a citizen-oriented representative government, not a monarchy or dictatorship. We have a constitution that was created as chains to bind governments to government's authority. Every politician in America swears an oath to abide by it. The powers they have, they get from the Constitution. So understand the Constitution in that light. Here's how we should read Romans 13. Every person is to be a subjection to the U.S. Constitution. For there is no Constitution except from God, and is established by God. Therefore, whoever resists the Constitution has imposed the ordinance of God, and they have opposed the Constitution, will receive commendation upon themselves. For the Constitution is not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of the Constitution? Do what is good, and you have the praise from the same. For the Constitution is a minister of God for your good. You for good. Interesting there, right? But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for the Constitution does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, the Constitution is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. Because of this you also pay taxes. For the Constitution is a servant of God, devoting itself to the very thing, rendered to all what is due to them. Tax to whom tax is due, custom whom to custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. He just added little things to Romans chapter 13, 1 through 7, of course. And so right here, so the Christian can be politically active and not be in violation of God's law. Telling our friends and neighbors that our institutions and politicians are corrupt and is not a violation of God's law, guaranteeing our ability to inform others of the government's transgressions so they can petition their representatives intelligently is precisely one of the First Amendment's purposes. Engaging in political disclosure or pointing out corruption is neither a violation of man's law nor God's, and we are to obey the law whether the leaders do so or not, as Christ told his disciples. As Peter said in Luke 5:29, we must obey God rather than men. But we should also remember Paul's admonition in Titus 3:2 through 5. to malign no one, to a peaceable, gentle, showing every consideration for all men. For we also once were foolish ourselves, disobedient to save, enslaved to various lusts and pleasures, spending our life in malice and envy, hateful, hating one another. But when the kindness of God, our Savior, and His love for mankind appeared, He saved us. So always respect your neighbors. We're always going to have certain battles and conflicts, but try not to use animosity, friends. Always focus on principles. That's what it means in that, how I see it. But very interesting. Remember, Jesus Christ was a maverick too, a rebel for his time. There were a lot of rebels in the Bible, and many other historical books as well. So you got to look at these areas. But when you have statists using the Bible for their personal lust, that is called tyranny. That is a demoniac platform. So it's okay to be rebellious in your own views, my friends. Always see things a lot bigger than what it is. Because if you sit there and do nothing, it will backfire. And you're the one who will say, what have I done wrong? I have nothing to hide. You never trust the government, period. Regardless where you live, in branches of government, federal, state, or local. So, you have those duties, implement them at the best of your abilities. And that is it. I thank everyone for listening. Plus, feel free to download and share us throughout your social media networks. Have any questions, comments, if you said something easy, man, to check out, whatever you do, please share your correspondence with decorum. I will post this on all my social media sites and email addresses on my Spreaker page, okay? Once again, thank you for your time. Plus, always remember that demoniac resistance helps to the soul and can liberate humanity. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Keep on spreading the love, and may your guardian spirits be with you.